What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button. Let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If we get this video to 1,000 likes, I will give one lucky commenter a cash prize. So make sure you like and comment your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. One of the most interesting people in the history of the Mafia is Harry, the Hunchback, Riccobene. Riccobene was nearly 5 foot tall. What he didn't have in height, he had in balls. Riccobene had been around the Mafia really since his teenage years in Philadelphia. That said, was Harry Riccobene actually a rat? Let's delve into his life next on the Sit Down. Harry Riccobene was born July 27th, 1909 in Sicily. He would live for a period of time in the mountainous town of Enna, which is in central Sicily. Essentially, it is dead center in Sicily. It's a rural place. And as far as what we know, Riccobene was the oldest son of a person called Mario and a woman called Annie. Now, from what we do know about Harry Riccobene's family, it may be possible that, according to multiple sources, his father was a mafioso in Sicily. He would come over, Harry's father, in 1911, and Harry's mother, alongside Harry and their other children, would come over in approximately 1914. So Harry was in his 4th or 5th year at that point. Now, according to the 1920 census, Harry Riccobene's family lived in Ward 2 in Philadelphia, which in those times and really today is South Philadelphia, essentially the Italian market, all the way down to Argan Avenue, essentially. Now, I don't know Riccobene's actual address. That said, if you know anything about the early Mafia in Philadelphia, it was right around the 9th Street Italian market. Now, as I said, Riccobene was a small man. In fact, he was only 5 foot tall, and he got that due to a curvature in his spine, and he really never grew that much. Now, and later in his life, he would develop a long beard and resemble kind of like a garden gnome, if you will. That said, he was a small but pugnacious individual, and we'll learn that he was a very powerful and strong man, even into his 70s. Now, Riccobene would state in multiple discussions that by the age of 16, he was already a hoodlum. And according to him, in and around 1927, he became a member of the Mafia, which would mean that he wasn't even 20 years old and he was already a mobster under Philly boss Salvatore Sabella. Now, that's obviously a photo that has been painted of Sabella. There aren't any known photos of him outside of a very grainy one that resembles Sabella. Now, Riccobene, in his early life in the 20s and 30s, was said to be everything from a bookmaker to a bootlegger. It was also said that he sold narcotics. He did what he had to do to survive. Now, according to a 1950 census, and this was right before Riccobene would go to prison, which I'll talk about, he lived in a home in the area of 3324 South Sydenham Street, which is in South Philadelphia, and he was listed as a salesman for a distribution company. Now, obviously, that wasn't what he really did, but the census would point out that he had a wife and one son at the time. I want to talk about Harry's brush with the law. He has a brush with the law record back to the 30s. That said, in the 50s, Riccobene was arrested for selling junk. According to the affidavit, and I'll read what Mr. Riccobene allegedly did. According to that affidavit, Riccobene, alongside a person called Anthony Crisci, would travel from New York City to the area of Cleveland, Ohio. Now, I will point out before I get into what Riccobene allegedly did, according to multiple factual historical records, including Riccobene's draft card from the early 40s, which he was approximately 30-ish years old, Riccobene's father, for a period of time, lived in the area of East 108th Street in Italian Harlem, in East Harlem. So it may be possible that Riccobene spent periods of time in New York City. Riccobene's father, as we know, was possibly a Sicilian mafioso and did live in Harlem. At that time, when Riccobene filled out his draft card, he listed his father's occupation as none. Now, it's unclear what Riccobene's father did for a living, but I am curious, did he play a role in Italian Harlem in any way? This is where maybe Riccobene left from to go to Ohio. Let's read about what Riccobene allegedly did. He, alongside Crisci, went to Cleveland. Now, Riccobene would bring a half of a kilo of pure brown, which starts with an H. I'm not going to say the word, which Riccobene carried in a cigar box. Upon his arrival, Riccobene would explain to two individuals that they needed a scale, cellophane bags, and milk sugar in order to mix, weigh, and package the H, and told them that he wanted to show the others how to mix it. When the required articles were procured by Crisci and another person called Paleofico, Harry Riccobene would dump the half kilo of H on a table and mix it with milk sugar, and the two individuals weighed it and poured it into 1 ounce packages. Now, after they were mixing the heroin, Riccobene discussed with Paleofico, Crisci, and Gonzalo the cost of the first kilo of H and the fact that it was on consignment, and the agreement that he had been sold to addicts and paid for, that he would recover the money and then they would receive the second half kilo. Now, the H's in question was subsequently distributed and sold in a mixture with milk sugar or quinine in 1 ounce packages. Now, down the road, evidence would introduce on behalf of the government, in addition to the proofs concerning the activities of Riccobene and Crisci, there were also arrangements with Crisci and subsequent deliveries made by Riccobene, and they would buy H from New York and deliver it to their connects in Cleveland, and down the road were indicted for conspiracy. This would give Riccobene a long prison sentence, and by the 60s, Riccobene hoped that due to his connections to people like Angelo Bruno, maybe Bruno could sway certain people in government to help out his pint-sized pal who was in federal prison. I want to talk about Riccobene's time in prison because he would serve at USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. And I want to talk about the fact that for over a year, Harry Riccobene would provide all sorts of information to the FBI. In approximately 1963, Riccobene was at Lewisburg. He would be visited by Special Agent David Walker. And eventually, we would start seeing an informant pop up known as PH599-C-TE. He was recontacted in late 1964, and over the year period from 1963 to 1964, it would be developed that this individual was Riccobene. Now, Riccobene not only discussed everything from members of the mafia, how it was created, it going back to Sicily, but he would talk about individual people, including Angelo Bruno, Philip Testa, Nicky Scarfo, and other members of other crime families. Here is a document where Mr. Riccobene discussed multiple people as, quote, friends of ours. He would discuss that Philip Testa was presently incarcerated at the Philadelphia Detention Center on contempt of court charges. However, Testa was doing, quote, all right. According to Riccobene, he feels that he's okay with the organization and he's not informed on anyone. Testa is hoping for a reversal of the contempt citation. Now, informant Riccobene would also meet Nicky Scarfo, who was introduced to him. He would refer to Scarfo as, quote, just a kid, and said that to his knowledge, Scarfo is not a member of the organization. Now, Riccobene would go on to also discuss people like Rocco Scafidi, Philip Testa, and refer to someone called Andy Scafidi as, quote, sick in the head. And again, in all this information, Riccobene would discuss all sorts of people. Now, he would also state that he didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but for over a year, he sat with members of the FBI and talked about all sorts of different people. Now, the FBI would state that they would last talk to Riccobene in late 1964, and by 1968, they had no contact with him. Now, Riccobene would be released in 1975 and head back to Philadelphia. At that time, obviously, the Philly mob was strong. They were one of the more powerful families in the country, headed by Angelo Bruno, and the good times continued for Riccobene. He went back to his old rackets, which included controlling bookmaking, loan sharking, vending machines, and he even had his own talent agency in South Philadelphia that he had with his brother Mario Riccobene, his half-brother. Now, one thing we do know that is under Angelo Bruno, Riccobene had his own little faction, if you will, and he operated essentially as a captain. It was said that he didn't kick up anything really to Angelo Bruno outside of maybe a Christmas tribute, and things are good for Riccobene. He was one of the more powerful people in the family. He had been around, look, by the 70s, Riccobene had been around since for 50 years. Remember, Riccobene was born in 1909, which shows how long he had been around. Riccobene operated just like he wanted to. That said, by the early 80s, the Philly mob was changing in a big way. His old pal Angelo Bruno was off the map as he was whacked, as well as Bruno's eventual successor, Philip Testa. And guess who became boss? As we know, little Nicky Scarfo, the man who once Riccobene called just a kid. And in the 60s, he was just a kid. He was a regular guy. He was not a powerful person at that point. And I don't think Riccobene ever truly respected him. Of course, how could he? And it goes back to the old notion. Older folks are not going to respect these young guys that come out of nowhere. Look at this genre. It's a prime example. The old guys like Capisci and Anastasia and Schratweiser and Scott Bernstein, they don't like people like me. I've become more powerful and popular than they are in this genre, and they don't like that. Same as Nicky Scarfo and Harry Riccobene. Now, the old man felt that the notion that he didn't have to pay a street tax would continue, and he could have his own faction and operate on his own level. That said, we know that Nicky Scarfo was a power-hungry maniac who said that he wanted a street tax from Riccobene, and Riccobene said essentially, F off. I'm not doing that. I'm controlling my own rackets. I'm down here in Southwest Philadelphia. I live in Southwest Philadelphia. I have my own people. I have my own things. You're not going to take nothing from me. So a war happens. And this is set off by the fact that Nicky Scarfo viewed Harry Riccobene and his people as insubordinate. And the kill list began. Now, this would be set off after Riccobene developed a hit list. And some of the people at the top included Long John Martirano and Scarfo's captain, a person called Frank Monti. This would come to a head in May of 1982. Monti was in the area of 70th Street and Grover's Avenue in Southwest Philadelphia when he was spotted by two Scarfo gunmen. He was shot in a parking lot from a rifle. Now, Riccobene had a list of other Scarfo people he was looking to take out, including, as I said, Long John Martirano, Salvi Testa, Joseph Cangolini, and Salvatore Chucky Merlino, the father of Joseph Skinny Joey Merlino. Now, Riccobene obviously got the upper hand by taking out Mr. Monti. That said, in his 70s, in June of 1982, Harry Riccobene was spotted at a payphone having a conversation with his 20-year-old girlfriend. Yes, a 70-year-old with a 20-year-old girlfriend. You got to give it to Harry for that. Riccobene, as we know, was quite a small man, and a person called Wayne Grandy ran up on him, shooting the telephone booth multiple times. Now, Mr. Riccobene was shot multiple times, though he still managed to wrestle the gun away from Wayne Grandy. Think about that. Riccobene was in his 70s, was shot multiple times, and a 20-something, a person who was about 100 pounds heavier than him, came at him with a gun. He wrestled the gun away and survived. That shows you the kind of tough guy Riccobene was. He was a stone-cold gangster for his whole life. Now, Riccobene, several months later, after recovering from his wounds in 1982, was traveling in his car in South Philadelphia where a gunman spotted him, shot up the car. However, it didn't hit Riccobene. Now, this comes subsequently after Riccobene ordered multiple assassins to whack Salvi Testa as he ate clams in the Italian market. As we know, Salvi survived, but it was a back and forth war between Riccobene and Nicky Scarfo. Now, Scarfo by this point was in prison, and he was upset that they couldn't get to Harry Riccobene and finally take him out. This is now 2 times they find Riccobene, but are unsuccessful in whacking him. The young or the old Riccobene had 9 lives, if you will. Now, the people that were under Nicky Scarfo that were tasked with trying to find Riccobene would state that they would look for him all day from like 7 a.m. to the middle of the night. They just couldn't get to him. They couldn't get rid of him, and they ultimately never did. Riccobene managed to avoid all of the comings of the Scarfo organization and was a tough old bird and never cracked. The problem is Riccobene suffered some of his own issues in the war because while they didn't get to him, they got to his brother, Robert Riccobene, in 1983. And I will admit this hit is a bit of a scumbag move by the members of the Scarfo organization who really went against everything that you're supposed to do. According to what we know, Riccobene's brother, Robert, a.k.a. Bobby, and his mother were coming out of a home in late 1983. They were spotted by a group of Scarfo loyalists, including Fafi Aniarella. Now, as they walked outside of the home, Robert Riccobene spotted Aniarella carrying a sawed-off shotgun. Riccobene took off running when Fafi, in pursuit, fired a blast, killing Robert Riccobene. Now, during the chase, Mrs. Riccobene, Harry's mom, grabbed Fafi and screamed at him to stop. Fafi responded by hitting the woman in the face with the butt of his shotgun. Now, again, this is not the type of thing that you were supposed to do. You're not supposed to whack someone connected to the mafia in front of their family and on top of it, assault someone with the butt of a shotgun. This was definitely a lowbrow move. Now, Fafi is much older, and this is when he was quite a younger man, and he served a long prison sentence. That said, this is always something that had come out of the Scarfo-Riccobene war. Eventually, the dust would settle, and this was the last thing that happened in this whole thing. By this point, though, Riccobene had to face his own demons. He and his brother Mario would be indicted by the government, and Riccobene had to face the fact that he may never get out of prison. That was coupled and hurt more due to the fact that eventually his brother Mario Riccobene would flip, and his chief enforcers, Joseph Padula and Victor DeLuca, both flipped as well. Now, they had him on the hook, Riccobene, for the hit on Frank Monte. Both the gunmen said that Riccobene sent them to do this, and he was hit with life, essentially, because of it. In the early 90s, Riccobene would be sentenced to life in state prison. He would die at the State Correctional Institution at Dallas in 2000. He was 90 years old. Now, we've seen Riccobene do some interviews with certain TV cameras and things of that nature. I think there's one thing about Riccobene that we could glean from his life. He was around the mafia for like 70 years. They tried to whack him a couple of times. It never happened. He went to war with Nicky Scarfo and didn't lose. And he was a tough old guy, man. They tried whacking him a couple of times. It never happened. To me, Riccobene, like if you ever ask me who are some of the most interesting people ever connected to the life, one of them has to be Riccobene. I mean, just a stone cold gangster. Did he talk? Yeah. And in terms of mafia protocol, he knew that talking to the government was against everything he stood for. He only did it for about a year, but it doesn't escape the fact that he did it. In the end, Riccobene, though, will not be known for that. He'll be known for the pint-sized tough guy he was. He had balls of steel. And in the end, never wavered from that. Made a lot of money, set up his family for a lot of years. But it's sad though, because he had things that he had to deal with. His own brother was whacked. His mother had to deal with some of the things of his transgressions. I also want to point out, in a weird twist of fate, Harry Riccobene's grandson was whacked in 2010. His name was Rocco Maniscalco, and nearly 15 years later, Mr. Maniscalco's death is still unsolved, according to the city of Philadelphia's police department. In June of 2010, Rocco Maniscalco was in the area of 17th and Wolf Streets in South Philadelphia watching a Philadelphia Flyers playoff game. He would leave the restaurant and walk to his home in the area of Colorado and Wolf in South Philadelphia. This bar is very close to his location. The father of four was gunned down on that corner. A lot of people have assumed that this had to do with the fact that maybe Maniscalco was in the street. And according to a lot of people that I've spoken to, it was well known that Maniscalco was a bookmaker, possibly. He also owned a tow company in South Philadelphia. And some people believe that this has something to do with Maniscalco not paying the right people, which, due to his blood, that was a norm. His grandfather never did it either. Now, we don't know why Maniscalco was whacked, and there are about 4 or 5 unsolved whackings, and I'm going to say whacking, I don't want to say the M word, in South Philadelphia, connected possibly to the mafia. It remains to be seen if Maniscalco's family will ever get justice. At the time of his death, he was 38. I hope you enjoyed this video on Harry Riccobene. If you did, show me some love in the comments, and make sure you like and comment. The more you comment, the better chance you have to win that cash prize if we get to 1,000 likes. So make sure you hit the like button and comment. We'll see you next week here on the Sit